Good evening, everyone. Vin here from No Nonsense Whiskey, of course. Time for another Dram Slam. Today we've got an excellent guest, but as always, before we do, we'll do my little intro and then we'll get straight into the comments and see who's in today and say hello to everybody. But as always, here's the intro. There we go. Intro done. Today we've got an excellent show on the go. But as always, before we go, we'll get into the chat and say hello. But a couple of little bit of housekeeping things, as I like to do at the start of these things. Today we're doing something slightly different because instead of streaming to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch, I knocked Twitch off, and I'm streaming to LinkedIn now as well, which is weird. I've never done that before. So yeah, I'll try and keep up with that because if comments pop in from that, I'll see if I see them. But I keep missing Facebook ones, but again, I'll see what I can do to make sure you get shouted out. So do feel free to comment on whatever platform you are on. But let's have a look in and see who jumped in early. Of course, we had Unicorn Blends in. Thank you very much for jumping in early. We've got Multi-Mission Menno. He's in as well. No quiz from him today. I don't tend to do quizzes because my streams are a bit shorter, but he's going to be busy this summer, I think, writing quizzes for non-Aquavitae people on VPubs. Me included. We've got me, my wife, and Whisky in. Thank you very much for joining. Codger, of course. He's asking where he's seen Scott before, but we'll get into that in a little bit. You know, he's old hat to this sort of thing. So, yeah, he's been around on YouTube. We've got the Dram Dandy Mitch. He's changed his name. He used to be Dame Judy Hench. So now he's actually revealing Mitch on there. Nice one. I think I missed someone then. Wraith. Hello. He says good evening. Thank you very much for coming in. Lots of my Discord people in. There's a link in the description below for Discord, by the way. If you like that sort of thing, it's a really good community there. But yeah, a lot of these people are from there. Alan's in. Nice one. Thank you very much for coming in. Gus is in. Thank you very much for joining, Gus. Don't often see you on these things. So yeah, I really appreciate you giving up your Monday to come and watch this. We've got Eric Gunderson in, and I think Unicorn Lens is down at the bottom still as well. Actually, there we go. We've got someone from LinkedIn. I'll put that up on the screen. Thomas O'Neill, thank you very much. So I'm not going to miss it today. I'm going to keep an eye on the old LinkedIn drops. And Simon Jackson just in as well. So what I'll do is I'm going to put that on there, and I'm going to bring Scott in after a very quick say hello to everyone else, and we'll get on with the stream. There you go. Hello, Scott. Hey. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you, Vin. How are you?
Very well. I'm trying to control the temperature in this studio, but it's been warm. You know, I've got a fan on under here, and I'll get redder and redder as the stream goes on. It's actually this light behind me here. I keep saying I'll replace it, but it's a big old halogen bulb. In this day and age of LED bulbs, I really should just have a non-heat outputting bulb.
To be fair, I don't think at the moment, regardless of what bulb you had, it would make too much of a difference. Up here, it's a bit grey and overcast today, but the last couple of months have been ridiculous, and it's the humidity is through the roof. It's impossible to live in. But Scotland in good weather, there's not many places in the world like it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I was saying to you, Preacher, I haven't spent so much time in Scotland. I did in the early 2000s because my wife went to university up there, but it was before I was just getting into whiskey, and it was before the channel. So for my sins, I never really explored too much while I was up there. But we keep meaning to go back up one day and do a proper exploration of the whole area. But there's a lot to do up there.
There's plenty to do. Yeah, you could spend a fair few months and still not see it all. But it's funny at this time of the year, for the last couple of years anyway, when people have been coming over, they're just like, "You guys said that the weather's bad here in Scotland." It's like, I know, we just try and keep the tourists away. So,
oh yeah, Yeah, it's the midgie season. Isn't it? That's anything you've got to avoid. If avoid the midgie season, you'll be all right.
Yeah. It's I've not had them too bad this year. I was walking in Fort William about a month ago, and that was pretty miserable. Beautiful day, but I had a bit of a hangover, and the midges seemed to enjoy my alcohol-fueled veins at the time. So, that's definitely something to look out for.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we've got a good a couple of things on the table today. Actually, before I get into it, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to reveal what this is yet. Some people will know if they've checked out the description below, but I'm going to pour this now. You know why? Because I think this deserves to be out for a little bit. I'm not going to pour it all because I'm going to treat myself to some of that later as well. Yeah. But that's our special dram for tonight. Usually what I do at the start of these things is ask my guest about their whiskey origin story, which I definitely didn't steal from Whiskey and Things before they dropped off. But yeah, I know you've been in the industry for a long time, but what got you into whiskey in the first place? What drew you to it before you became a professional?
It kind of happened at the same time, if I'm being honest with you. Whiskey got me into whiskey. I think like most young lads in the north of Scotland, I had experiences of whiskey, probably at an age that it was not okay. I certainly remember having that first whiskey that made me go, oh, wow, that's better than I expected. I was always, as a late teenager, I was always a Jack and Coke man. That was my go-to kind of in the pub on a Friday night with my mates. But for whatever reason, one night someone handed me a Jura Superstition. And I just remember thinking, oh, wow, that's not what I thought whiskey was. That's very different. And I would love to say that from there I went on to, drink whiskey all the time. That's not true. I was at university and there was an internship at Tomatin distillery going. And, I almost feel bad saying it, but I remember looking at it and Googling Tomatin and going, wow, that packaging's really cool, And so I applied for the job, not on the basis of the packaging, on the basis of what the job was. And during that 8-week internship, fell in love with whiskey. I think one thing I always say is we're spoiled by the fact that it's on our doorstep up here. Everybody, I went to school with a handful of people whose dads worked in distilleries. My grandfather worked at a distillery. It's another blue collar job. It was like being a lorry driver or something like that, being a joiner, being a plumber. So you don't really think it's anything too special. You walk past these distilleries. Where I live up in Allness here, I've got Dalmore and Tininic distillery on my doorstep. They're right there, It wasn't until I started working at Tomatin and spending a bit of time with the guys on site and watching what they do and sampling some of the whiskey. And I think really just seeing how passionate everyone was about the thing they were making and the degree of care and knowledge that went into it, that I started to notice this is actually a really cool thing that we've got here. And anyone who is from here should be immensely proud of it. And at the same time, I was going to whiskey tastings in the whiskey shop in Inverness just about every Friday night. And it all just kind of happened at one time. In an 8-week period, I went from knowing nothing about whiskey to still knowing almost nothing about whiskey, but knowing that I enjoyed it. And then that sparked the next, we're on to year 11 now, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to talk a little bit about that later on, but a lot of the ambassadors I speak to, and I speak to quite a few over the years that I've been doing my thing, and there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of movement in the industry, moving between different distilleries and companies and whatnot. Very rarely do you find someone time served like yourself, even though you took a gap year, let's say, in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But you're 10, 11 years now at Tomatin, aren't you?
Yeah, so the way it kind of happened was, it was the summer of 2012 that I got my internship there, and I still had a year to complete at university. But the now managing director, sales director at the time, Stephen Bremner, at the end of the internship kind of said, if you'd like to stay on a couple of days a week and help out in sales and marketing, we'd be more than happy to have you. There might be a job as an ambassador once you finish your degree. And I was delighted to say yes, if for nothing else, that it meant that I could pack in my job at Morrison's, which was, I wasn't passionate about stacking shelves. I was passionate about whiskey. And took that job at Tomatin. So for that first kind of, I guess it would have been about 9 months in all told, I worked in the sales and marketing team, also spent a bit of time in production. And then just as I was about to finish my degree, the European sales manager at the time left the company. And Stephen came back to me and said, that job as an ambassador is not available, but would you like to be the European sales manager? Now, I had never sold a thing. I studied history. So he took a punt, and I of course said yes. And so from 2013 through to 2017, I was European sales manager at Tomatin. Learned a huge amount in that time. And that was, Tomatin's still small. We're still 72 people, I think, in the company. But back then, it really felt small. So you would be working commercially across these markets, but then spending time in those countries, doing shows, doing tastings, working at festivals, hosting masterclasses. At the distillery, I was getting involved in writing tasting notes and working on developing new products. You had to do everything. Then in 2017, I was offered a job at White & Mackay. And as I say, I grew up right next to Dalmore Distillery, effectively. My grandfather used to collect the draft from the distillery. My other grandfather used to be the mashman through at Invergordon Grain Distillery. So the kind of hopeless romantic in me kind of thought, oh, it'd be cool to work for the local company. And I worked there for a year, and that was a great experience. I was looking after what was called venture markets. So it was mostly Eastern Europe into like sort of Israel and over into Kazakhstan and things like that as well. So that was a great experience. But I kind of in the end got to the point of missing that small company in the kind of relationship. My job had become quite a one-dimensional, very commercial role. And like I say, it was a great job for me at the time, but there wasn't a lot of involvement in the liquid itself. And by this point, I was a fully fledged whiskey geek, and you were getting some great samples at the distilleries, and you were getting to take home some excellent bottles on your staff allowance, but I wasn't getting to speak about whiskey. And so I was then offered randomly, one night I went for a curry with the guys that I worked with at Tomatin, and they offered me to go back as the global brand ambassador and to also start working alongside Graham Munson, our master distiller, in a cask selection blending capacity. And so then about a year and a half ago, was kind of moved from global brand ambassador to blender and global brand ambassador. And that's where we are today.
That's massive. That is. It's good that you've basically had people offering you jobs for the last few roles, which is awesome. I like that sort of thing. But that obviously it must make you feel good because you know that you're valued within the industry. And obviously, despite getting a job as a global brand ambassador, then COVID hitting, retaining that role, which is remarkable, really, because you couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah, no, it was the oddest thing. I remember, and I'll always give full credit to Daz Haldane, who's now over at Beam Suntory. We had worked together at White & Mackay, and he was going to be traveling up to, I think he was going to be traveling up to Dalmore, and we'd arranged to grab a beer and a pizza. And the very same day that we arranged that is when all the lockdowns hit and we had to start working from home. And I just messaged him going, I take it you won't be coming up next week then. And he sent a message back going, our jobs are going to get a little bit, I think he said, our jobs are going to change for a while. I was like, yeah, they certainly are. And a lot of people across the company went on to furlough at that stage. I was pretty keen to just keep active. And the company, I guess, gave me a lot of rope, and I was able to not hang myself, so to speak. So got to do some pretty cool things. Got to work, oddly enough, got to work a lot more closely with the marketing guys because we were coming up with concepts on the fly. The lockdown whiskey festival. We had every Tuesday night I was doing an Instagram takeover. Every Friday night we had a softer side session that we still get people asking, are you gonna do something? You're gonna do one of those again? And I would love to say yes, we've got great plans, but honestly now it's. I think one thing that COVID did in many ways for a company like us, it leveled the playing field a little bit because now I was able to do tastings around the world in one day, in the same way that a company with 20 ambassadors was. So I would wake up super early and do a tasting for Asia. I would do some training in the UK in the afternoon, and then in the evening I would be doing a tasting for the States or Canada. But what's happened since then is these markets still have the same demand for a brand ambassador, but now we have to be there in person. So the travel's got a little bit crazy in the last 12 months, which is no bad thing. After 2.5 years without it, it's been a welcome return. But yeah, it's a bit manic.
100%. Yeah, I mean, I'm talking of the lockdown festival that you did with obviously Roy.
Yeah.
Roy famously says that I travel like a tree, which is true. So COVID was perfect for me. I'm quite happy sitting in my little bubble. I mean, I'm down in the Midlands of England, and there's no whiskey down here at all. You know, Cotswolds nearest, about 45 minutes. Apart from that, you've got to go hours to get anywhere. So yeah, it is what it is. Before we go on to more questions, then I've got the 12-year-old in my glass. There you go. So usually, I mean, the benefit of having someone like you on, so usually I would have to review and do a load of research, but I've got you here, so you can tell me about this.
Certainly can, yeah. So while you're having a wee smell of it there, I'll tell you a little bit. The background for me of the 12-year-old is something that I particularly like. We call this our flagship nowadays. This was first released in the late 1990s, around about 1997, as an America exclusive. It was only available in the States, and at the time, it was the oldest whiskey that we were releasing. You know, we had a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, and then a 12-year-old for America. And then in 2003, the 12-year-old replaced the 10-year-old in our core range, and has been in the core range ever since. So for the last 20 years, it's been in there. And what I think this does particularly well is tell you not only about Tomatin, which is a difficult thing to do because it's a range that's kind of summarized by variety. You know, the core range, you'll find bourbon casks, port casks, sherry casks, virgin oak casks. There's a lot going on in the core range. So it's difficult to kind of summarize what Tomatin's all about in one whiskey. I think if anything can do it, it's the 12-year-old. But beyond that, I think the 12-year-old for me is kind of a classic Highland single malt. And that's from someone who doesn't kind of subscribe to the whiskey regions. The idea that 150 distilleries can be summarized by 5 flavor categories, to me, it just seems a bit reductive. I totally understand. It's a great kind of roadmap when you're new to it. But all of a sudden you find yourself drinking something like a Bunnahabhain and a Bruichladdich saying, I thought this was meant to be smoky. You know?
Yeah.
So I don't subscribe to the whiskey regions, but what I do think the 12-year-old does is it draws influence from across the Highlands. The Highlands is the one region that nobody was ever able to pinpoint because it's so large. The distilleries are so spread out. But Tomatin, geographically, is right at the bullseye of the Highland whiskey region. It's right at the crosshair. And I've always kind of said that the 12-year-old takes that and then, you know, draws inspiration from some of the bolder, more sherry-packed whiskies from the north of the Highlands. It draws inspiration from some of the fruitier whiskies from the Eastern Highlands, some of the lighter floral notes, the elegance of the lower Highlands, and then that earthiness, not necessarily smoke, but the earthiness from the Western Highlands. And the way we do that, it's the most difficult whiskey to make in our range, if I'm being honest. Graham Yunson was asked that a couple of years ago, what's the most difficult whiskey to make? And I think I think it was asked with the expectation being, our 50-year-old's really difficult to make or something. Ultimately, that was a single cask. It was quite easy to make. The 12-year-old's our biggest selling product, and we have to ensure consistency. So we use 3 cask types here. And the recipe calls for a third, but upon tasting, we'll have to tweak that. So 1/3 will be first fill bourbon barrels. Just Tomatin is at home in bourbon barrels. That kind of apple, pear, fruitiness of the new mix spirit works really well with the honey, the vanilla, the white chocolate that a bourbon barrel is going to give you. I was speaking to someone today and saying, we've been using bourbon barrels at Tomatin for over 100 years now, which is significantly longer than the industry as a whole. That was way before the 1930s prohibition. The second third of the casks there will be sherry casks, and that's a combination of Oloroso and PX, mostly Oloroso. but just a little bit of PX to add. What I love is that PX is such a sweet wine in terms of its sugar content, but the flavors are things that I would typically call quite bitter. You get a licorice, you get an espresso, you get a dark chocolate from a PX cask. That adds that depth in there. And then finally, we're going to use refill casks. So with every Tomatin that we release, be it something like Legacy, which is right at the entry level, all the way through to the oldest whiskies we'll release, we want a balance between distillery and maturation character. If your distillery character is not coming through, you could be putting any spirit in there and just loading it up with cask flavor. It's why I hate the term sherry bomb. I don't hate the term. I just don't think it's a good thing. I think it's quite a good descriptor of a whiskey that's been obliterated by the cask. But I totally understand it. What we're looking for is that balance between the influence of the maturation and the spirit character itself. The guys have worked incredibly hard to create this wonderful new mix spirit. We want some of those flavors in there. And so the refill casks are going to allow those to flourish. So you'll get that layer of apple, of pear. For me, there's a rhubarb element in the Tomatin new mix spirit. You'll get that nice malty backbone. You layer in there the sherry flavors. It's that Christmas cake. It's the dried fruit. You then have that sweetness from the bourbon with that honey, that vanilla. And overall, for me, if I close my eyes and smell this whiskey, it's got that kind of forest floor type of thing, that pine needle earthiness, that fruit. Yeah, it's for a kind of core product, mass market, widely available, biggest selling whiskey. It's got a lot going on there.
Yeah, definitely. The funny thing about something like this is that my whiskey journey is probably about, well, what am I now? So it must be coming up to nearly 20 years ish, maybe not quite that much. But I went through a bit of a weird sort of cycle with it all, and there was a time when I would have called something like this, like just like typical Scotch, something like that. And I've come right back round to this sort of flavor profile now, and I'm really moving away from really big bold flavors to just like really nice, well-rounded, and this has got so much depth to it that it doesn't need to punch me in the face to be enjoyable. And that's kind of something I'm learning even now, because that's what I'm usually after. I'm usually after like cask strength, peated, that sort of thing.
No, I would agree with that. I would say that the 12-year-old, it really performs that role of being a traditional malt whiskey very, very well. This is the style of whiskey that if my grandfather had come to the house, this is what I would have poured for him just instinctively, just because it's the class. Anyone that enjoys a whiskey will recognize that immediately. It's the sort of thing that personally I'll drink with a little beer beside it. It's a great half and half whiskey. It does. It was, again, I was having a conversation with someone earlier saying it's very rare that you will find me with this whiskey in a Glencairn glass. It's normally in a tumbler. It's the whiskey that is part of the situation. It's not the situation itself. It's just something that if I'm watching a film or watching some sports or having a chat, it's a great dram for that. But then you put it into a Glencairn and you actually go, right, beyond that kind of surface level, good drinking whiskey, what's going on here? And there's plenty of depth, like you say. It's an elegant malt. There's complexity. There's layers there. It does both things very well. And I always go back to, like you're saying there, you can have big, bold flavors, absolutely. But if you just want something subtle, a drinking whiskey, a nuanced dram, this is ideal. And it's this sort of whiskey that I think gets people into whiskey. I think a lot of people, if their first dram is a cask strength Isla beast, they might love it. They're off to a good start if they do. But for me, it was a supermarket whiskey that kind of made me go, "All right, okay, that's interesting." So I'm always urge people not to knock things just because they're widely available.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was asked fairly recently if I could pick a dram off my shelf to give someone who was new to whiskey a kind of intro, which one would I pick? And my answer was a bit like wishy-washy, but essentially this is what I genuinely do. I would never give anyone something cask strength or heavily peated. What I'd usually do is create a mini tasting set of blind drams, and I try to cover couple of different countries, a couple of different flavor profiles, ending with something peated. But even that will be 46% tops.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of thing that I would definitely put in there,
Yeah.
to be like, and then I'll decide what they like, and then I'll go at what bottle to get them from there.
Yeah.
But if I just let them go nuts, they'll blow their palate so quickly.
Yeah, I think it's funny, you know, it goes against everything I said a little moment ago, but the kind of ideal way to build that flight is to pick a classic thing from each region, you know. So the regions work when you have the thing that it's meant to be, you know. So if you say Highland whiskey and you've got that, you're doing well. It's when you go to something a little bit quirky, you know, that you're like, maybe it doesn't work for all of them. But as a basis, it covers a wide range of flavor, and you can navigate that quite well.
Yeah, no, and you were dead on with what you said earlier as well. So, I mean, yeah, all right, what we're talking about now, you would create like a little bit of a regions of Scotland thing. But I've always said the same thing that you said there. I mean, there was a time when you had to use the materials that were on your doorstep to make your whiskey. But now with obviously like, you know, haulage and trains and all that lot, and obviously distilleries coming out of being illegal and into the forefront, you can make whatever you want wherever you are.
Yeah,
you know, so it does become, the regions do become a little bit irrelevant.
Yeah,
unless you're doing local stuff.
Absolutely. We always talk about this with Kubalkan, which is our lightly peated malt, and we only make that for 1 week a year. But up until the 1960s, the vast majority of whiskey from Tomatin, in fact, all of it, would have been lightly peated, because that's when we had floor maltings on site. That's when we were cutting the peats on the mountain in the summer, and we were letting them dry and then using them the next year. But then in the 1960s, you've got North Sea oil, you've got the A9, you've got large-scale maltings, you've got the boom of blended whiskey globally and people looking for something less peated. So you do at a time, you lose a little bit of regionality, but I think at the same time, that's when distilleries developed their own kind of unique identity. Some would have stayed truer to the more classic style that had been made for hundreds of years. Some would have developed to go after different business. For us, in the 1960s and 70s, we became pretty much the backbone of the malt whiskey, of the blended whiskey industry. We were producing 12.5 million litres a year. We had to be producing a light, fruity, versatile, elegant, complex malt that could go into a wide variety of blends. And, you know, today the focus is absolutely on the single malt. We make 2.5 million litres, but it's still built around that versatile, fruity, malty spirit. And the way we play on that versatility now is using a wide variety of casks and creating a range of our own products. But yeah, I think regionality was lost, but individuality was gained during that process.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, because 100%, and distilleries that can sort of retain a bit of DNA throughout their core range, like you guys can. I mean, I'm not that studied up on Tomatin, to be honest. I've covered a couple on the channel. The legacy, definitely, because that I've been challenged a couple of times on blind tastings where that one's been in, and for me, the nose on that thing is mind-blowingly good. It's so good that it's always second or third out of 5 or 6 for me, every single time, and I genuinely blind all the time. So I had to have a bottle of it at one point. I am understudied, because although like you said before, you guys kind of took COVID and made yourself like come out into the open a little bit, but before that I hadn't really heard from Tomatin much in the space, which is cool.
It's funny. I think back now 10 years going and doing tastings and saying at the beginning, how many of you have heard of Tomatin? And you know, maybe on a good night, quarter of the people had tried a Tomatin before. Now there's a lot of tastings I go to where quarter of the people have been to the distillery. There's very few tastings that I go to now where nobody's heard of it. And in some ways I miss it. In some ways I'm like, oh wow, when someone says I've never heard of it, I'm like, you're in for a treat. I'm almost jealous of people that haven't tried Tomatin, because it's like you're about to experience something excellent for the first time. But it has been nice to see that shift, because it means, I guess in one way, it means that I've been doing my job okay. But it means that the brand's been well received, and I think you look at what we've achieved in terms of growing the brand, growing the business, the recognition the products are getting, the distilleries getting. It's almost unmatched. The growth has been incredible.
Absolutely, and I'm all for it as well, because it's whiskey's still growing. I keep saying, I'm 7 years deep in this August, and I keep waiting for the sort of the boom to stop, but it just keeps going and going. It ebbs and flows a little bit through summer. Summer's always a little bit of a lull for us, but it just keeps going, and long may it continue.
Yeah. I think we said that about gin maybe a decade ago. Just it'll fade away eventually. It'll fade away eventually. It just hasn't, and nothing has. I think that's where, this current whiskey boom that we have is very different to what was had in the past, where, you had the whiskey boom in the post Second World War, and then vodka overtook it. And what you've got now is just a quality product boom. People like good things. This drinking better, not more, and that's gone across. You see, 10 years ago, a cocktail bar in Inverness, people would have laughed you out of the town, but now there's a handful of them because people want quality drinks, and I think everyone's benefiting from that.
Definitely. I mean, I was saying on the last one of these streams, there was a time, obviously, like no age statement whiskey, in a time where we're talking about an age statement whiskey, but no age statement whiskey is becoming more and more prevalent. But when it first started coming in, when a lot of the old Scotch producers were starting to run out of stock, there was a couple of really bad ones that came through. Again, not on name any names. People know my opinions on some of that, and it got called out so quickly. We were talking about this just before we went live. It got called out so quickly that it's almost you can't put out bad stock. So it's really great to see exactly what you were saying there. There's a boom of quality. I like that as well. I'm making a list of all the things that you say that I like. And I like that as well, because that's a really good way of putting it, that it's not necessarily a boom of whiskey, but a boom of quality.
I think, we touched on it a little bit before we went live here about the base level of quality is higher than it's ever been. I quite often, sometimes you do hear pessimistic views. There's never been a better time to be a whiskey fan than right now. There's never been more availability, more variety. The base quality has never been higher. And I think the reason for that is, if we go back 10, 15 years and we talk about those whiskies that, they maybe weren't as good, that was because they were still being produced. When they were distilled, they were still distilled at a time where the likelihood was they would go into a blend. But then what happened was, you got to the point where single malt was booming, and you had to use that stock that was designed for blends and to go somewhere else and make it quality. Whereas now we're really getting into that stage where we're drinking whiskey that was designed to be drunk as single malt. It was distilled with that intention in mind. And I would say, that's really only happened in the last 15 years. From a production point of view, we look at the changes that have been made in the way we make whiskey at Tomatin. Now, the overall characteristics of this spirit are the same, the kind of the fundamentals, but the focus that's put on consistency, on slowing things down, on balance, just making sure that every time you drink this product, it's going to be a good single malt. I think that's what we're noticing coming into life now. Yeah,
completely agree. We've actually got a few comments knocking around. If I'm going to field you some quick questions, but before I do that, I got a super chat from Unicorn Blends. Whiskey follows the heart, not the trend. Like that. I like that a lot. Yeah. Going back a little, then hopefully I haven't missed any questions. If I did, then I apologise. Christopher Malloy is asking, why don't we see more special releases from Tomatin? And that was sort of answered in the chat a little bit, but yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about special releases because I don't know Tomatin's range that great.
I mean, we do release limited editions every year. So we've got the core range, which is Legacy 12, Cask Strength 14 and 18-year-old. We then have our batch releases, the 30, the 36, and we have the higher end stuff. But every year we'll have limited editions kind of ranging from 12 years into the teens. So for the last few years, we've been doing a selection of countries. So Last year we had the Portuguese collection. The year before we had the French collection. We've done things like occasionally we'll just drop into the UK market. Here's a Fino release, so they are there. I think it's just a case of the volumes are quite small. When we're talking about a limited edition, we're talking about a limited edition. It's 1,000 cases. That's 6,000 bottles spread over 60 markets worldwide. So they are available. The best thing you can do for that sort of thing, sign up to our newsletter at Tomatin, sign up to our social media pages, give us a follow, and you'll be the first to know then. And a lot of the time we're announcing it before it goes live. We're at the moment, for example, we're just coming towards our summer shutdown. So for the last 2 weeks, we've been doing a malt trial, and I'll be filming a little video this week explaining what the malt trial was. That's something you're not going to see for 10 years. If you're following ourselves, if you're doing that, you'll be made aware of this, and then it's really a case of, once you're aware of it, go and find it. Then it's over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Unicorn Blends is going back to the Kuboken, saying, would you think that's more an apt representation of true Tomatin style from yesteryear?
Well, I think you summed it up there by adding yesteryear, because it goes back to what's the true Tomatin. I would say the true Tomatin is what we have now. That spirit that was developed kind of 60s into the 70s, that fruity, non-peated spirit. I would say the Tomatin 12-year-old is it's Tomatin 101. That is what Tomatin is now. I would say the Kuboken spirit, the new make, is probably the closest thing that we produce today to what would have been produced when the distillery was founded in 1897. But we take a more modern approach to maturation. So we use a variety of casks. We use more first fill casks. We lean on having that cooperage there that allows us to access casks from around the world. So it's the Kuboken spirit, I would say, is a more historical representation of Tomatin. But the Tomatin 12-year-old, I would say, is, if you want to pour a dram for someone and say, this is Tomatin, that's the one you're going to go for.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and it's still fairly reasonably priced as well. I think what's it, about 45 quid, something like that, a bit less if you're looking around. Thor is asking, I mean, this is a bit of a loaded question, I guess, but if he's going to buy a whiskey tomorrow, can you recommend a single malt for me, please? As Andrew Butler saying, it's got to be a Tomatin, right?
It certainly does, and then it just comes down to how much do you want to spend tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, there was another one from Mitch saying earlier that his first experience with Tomatin was the cask strength, and that was actually my first experience, but I think I might have been a bit further in my journey than he was, because I remember being my mind blown by it. It was such good value, and it's one of the first no-age statement whiskies I ever tried, and it was just incredible. But he said it was probably a little bit early for him, and he should go back to it maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those ones as well that generally that question, what can you recommend for me? We get that all the time at festivals, and it's not a bad question. If someone comes up to you and says, I'd like to try Tomatin, what can you recommend? I can easily tell you what one I like, but the best way to answer that question is, well, what do you enjoy? What was the last whiskey that you tried and thought, oh wow, I really like that? What's your go-to malt at the moment? And then from that, myself, and I think most of the team in our visitor centre and in our kind of events team, are now in a position that they know enough about whiskey themselves to say, okay, you like that? Here, have a go of this. That's a nice sherry matured whiskey. Try our 18-year-old. Oh, you like some wine casks? Oh, you can try one of our French collection or something. Or, you quite often have someone come up and go, I really like Maker's Mark, which I do as well. I'm a big fan. Try Tomatin Legacy. If you like bourbon, that's a good step into the Tomatin single malt. So it's really a case of what do you enjoy, and we'll find something for you. And then going on to the cask strength thing, absolutely right. It was a few years before that I was working in whiskey before I really kind of got the need for it, if you know what I mean. So for me, I don't ever remember drinking whiskey and thinking, wow, this is not strong enough, So it took a little bit of time. And then I remember, I think the first time I tried our cask strength whiskey, and it really, and this was after being part of developing the product and really advocating for it. So we were doing shows around Europe 2014, and I had a sample of the Tomatin 14-year-old, which was about to be launched, but it was at cask strength. And the feedback was, wow, your spirit is so drinkable at high proof. You need to release this, brought that feedback to the team, and we released the cask strength in 2015. But I remember the first time that I really properly engaged with it and enjoyed it was out of a hip flask up a mountain, and I was like, "Oh wow, no, this is good," So yeah, I think it's a case of getting yourself to the right place where you're in the right situation to really enjoy that, and then and again, for me, cask strength whiskey will maybe be about 10% of what I actually drink. But when I do, now I know how to enjoy it and when to enjoy it, so it's good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got to you got to treat it with a bit of respect, haven't you? Cask strength. I mean, I remember when I tried it very specifically. It would have been maybe 2017, 2018, something like that. And I was in I was in Cumbria in a tasting for House of Malt. And it was a bloggers event, and I was at the back of the room with a couple of buddies of mine pouring that out. Someone gave it around for us to free pour it, and we were just tittering away like school kids trying this thing. I was like, and it just blew my mind.
Yeah.
George is asking this. I don't know if you'll have tried this, but he said, "Have you tried the Tomatin Warehouse 6 1977?"
Yes, I have. I've
Oh.
been very lucky to be involved in the Warehouse 6 collection from kind of its inception with the 1971. I remember when we launched the 1971, it was the first time we had ever done anything super premium, Up until that point in time, I think the 30-year-old and the 36-year-old were the high end of the range. And we launched in 1971, and myself and my colleague, Scott Fraser, drove down in the Tomatin van to London to the launch event with the box in between us, because we didn't trust any of the courier services. We did the event, and then we drove back up the road that night, and we got to the office just as people were arriving to start work the next day. So been involved in it from the beginning, and luckily we've found courier services that are far better since then than me and Scott in a van. The 77 for me, top two anyway, and on the right day, my favorite of that collection. So the 77 and the 76 are really, really special whiskies. The 76 was Graham Yunson's favorite ever casks of whiskies, been in whiskey for over 30 years. And when he joined us in 2011, he arranged for a sample to be drawn from every parcel of stock that we had. And that's what you still see when you go into the sensory room at the distillery, is the samples that were drawn when Graham started. And I think that's quite a cool thing. So start of one man's journey in Tomatin. And he marked those casks out on day one as the best whiskies he's ever tried, and was always looking for an excuse to release them. So the 76 was released as the final expression in the collection. But the 77 for me was special. This was the first ever Sauterne matured whiskey that we released, and it was outrageously good. Tomatin in its later years has these incredible tropical notes. It's big, big, big oxidation esters coming through, and the Sauterne cask with all that honey and apricot flavor just layered on top of that beautifully well. Maybe not for you if you don't have a slightly sweet tooth, but an outrageously good whiskey.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, it's I always joke it's getting harder and harder to try whiskies that are older than me for a good value. I mean, they're out there obviously, but I just don't have infinite cash.
Yeah.
And obviously, as I get older, that age gets higher and higher.
Yeah, I concur.
Yeah. But talking of which, we do have a good one coming up. I have one more question from the thing, and then we'll get onto that little butte.
Nice.
And this is from he's gone back to Dame Judy Hench. It wasn't a criticism, Mitch. Yeah, I like it. It's a funny name. I like it. But yeah, he says, do you struggle to convince people to have more basic drams before launching into a higher an age or an ABV as possible? Like for me personally, before I do a proper tasting online or whatever, I like to have something really, really basic and casual, just to wake my palate up a little bit. But personally, I never struggle because usually people take my advice. But yeah, I don't know if that's you mirror that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree to a large extent that 99 times out of 100 nowadays, people will go, okay, this is the person that knows what they're talking about. You'll occasionally have someone coming up at a show and just going, I just want to try the 30-year-old, particularly when they're free, which they rarely are nowadays. But there were certainly times in the past where there would be certain countries we'd be in where just and I think the UK is the same a lot of the time. Once you've paid your entrance fee, the whiskey's free. So nowadays, if that is the case, and I see that, what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll take that bottle off the table, and I'll wait until someone's properly engaged with the range and really enjoyed it, and say, okay, right, you've liked that. Here, have a go of this. But actually, most of the time, what I'll do is just say to someone, "Have you tried Tomatin before?" And if the answer is no, I'll just say, "Well, you've got to start with a 12-year-old." And it's not being forceful. It's just like, if you really want to understand what we're all about, if you've taken the time to come to this show, and you want to experience our whiskey, have a little drop of the 12-year-old. You don't have to have a full dram of it or a measure, but give that a go. Let me know what you think. And then I'll help you pick the next one you want. And if at the end you still want to try that 30-year-old, we can absolutely do that. But I'm going to tap into the things that you liked and didn't like about that whiskey and try and guide you through what we've got to offer. And I think that is ultimately about dispelling the kind of myth that older means better. But I'm saying that just ahead of the whiskey that we're about to try.
Absolutely. I mean, before we get into that, it's funny you should say that about under-the-counter drams as well, because I remember my first experience of that was at the London Whisky Show, and I went to go and speak to Shilton when he was working for Paul John, and I'd met him a couple of times before, and we were chatting, and we walked off, and he came back over to us as we'd walked off, and he was like, "You're supposed to ask me what I've got under the counter." And I was like, "Is that a thing? Does that happen?" And then he had some like cask that was long gone. I can't remember what it was now. I want to say 636 or something like that. Some special cask they had.
Yeah.
And it was after that I was just like, now that I get to know reps like yourself and I see them, and I'm like, do you have anything under the counter? Yeah.
Again, though, and maybe this says more about my personality, but I've almost gone full circle. When someone comes up and says, because quite often you'll get people coming up straight away now and saying, "Do you have anything special under the counter?" I'm like, no. For me, it's like, let's have a good chat. Let's see what you've liked. And then I'll go, okay, because there's always something, even if it's not a bottle, I'll typically have a hip flask of a sample. I'm like, right, let's have a look at this. And that was, it was Dave from Boutique Whiskey that I got that off of, just having a little hip flask. And it's like, oh yeah, that's a cool thing. What are you enjoying at the moment? It doesn't have to be something extra special. It's just a case of come and see what I found, and that's quite cool as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think my favorite experience, and the thing I like about this is that he could quite clearly have lied. Which Colin Dunn, legend in the whiskey world, I've met him a couple of times now at different shows. He saw me come in from a mile off, waved me over, and he was like, "None of this. You can have some of this." And he pulled this unmarked bottle out. Let me try it, and it was allegedly a Lafroig from the 70s.
All right.
Allegedly, I say allegedly because by that point I was like 12 drams deep, and it made no difference to me whatsoever.
Yeah,
but like I said, he could have just lied and made me feel special for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But it was still an incredible experience that he even recognised me. But amazing. The whiskey world is amazing. We all know that.
It's pretty special. I'm yet to come across anything quite like it in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's what got me into it. It was, a casual leisure thing for me. And then when I started really looking online and seeing what was there and just being blown by it.
Yeah.
So talking about being mind blown, then we've been teasing it all the way through. I'm sort of going into this a bit pre-mind blown, as I said to you before, but you were kind enough to send me a sample if it's going to focus, which I don't think it's going to, but this is a 36-year-old batch 11. This is a new release, right?
Yeah, batch 11 was this year's bottling. And so the 36-year-old was launched back in 2015 now. And as you say, we're on to the 11th batch of it. And each batch was historically limited to 800 bottles a batch. But it got to the point where the reputation of this whiskey was just getting better and better and better. And we were getting through those 800 bottles within 6 months. So we kind of wanted to get to the point where we would have a batch release every year. So we've increased it to 1,200 bottles, but at the same time, we've moved it away from 46% to cask strength, which ironically is lower than 46% now because of the age of some of the whiskey going in there, 36-year-old being the youngest, of course. Batch 11 that you have now, I believe it's 45.7%, has just won the best in class and the best in show at the San Francisco World Spirits Competition, which is an amazing thing. And I think, there's a lot of skepticism about awards within the community right now. And I think it's healthy skepticism, because there's certainly some awards where you can pay to win if you want. But with San Francisco, you've got 40 judges who are experts in spirits from around the world. They all meet in San Francisco, and they are blind tested on thousands of spirits. This year, there were 1,800 whiskies entered into the competition, and they were all tasted blindly. And what the judges can do is award you either nothing, or they can award you a bronze, a silver, or a gold medal. In order to get a double gold medal, every judge has to award you gold medal. So that's the first step. If you've got a double gold, this means that 40 experts rate that as a gold standard. Then this went on to win the best Scotch whisky, which in and of itself, an incredible thing. Batch number 4 did that all the way back in 2017 as well. It won the best Scotch whisky. But then this went on to win best in class, which named it, of those 1,800 whiskies, the best whiskey at the show this year. Beyond all of those things, it's just a great whiskey. I think that's the point, is, you get to the point where you're winning a double gold medal. It goes back to what we were saying earlier on. It's hard to find bad whiskey nowadays, but this is right on the exceptional mark. So the way we make this, so this is a batch release, and the difference between the batch release and the core range is that with our batch release products, we have a recipe, and once we've vatted that recipe together, that's it. There's no tweaking it or anything. So this allows us to celebrate the fact that from batch to batch, there's going to be differences. Even though the recipe is the same, casks are living, breathing things. They're going to give you different expressions of flavor every time. And the recipe here calls for, so all the whiskey starts off in refill casks. And that's the key here. The secret of the 36-year-old, if you will, is putting it into inactive casks for a very, very long period of time. A lot of the time when we talk about flavors in whiskey, we're talking about the influence of the cask, whether that's the wood or the previous contents being added into the spirit. When it comes to refill casks, you've got this, 36 years of oxidation. We lose about, first of all, of evaporation. So we're going to lose about 40% of the content due to evaporation. That gives an incredible headspace. All that air gets in, the oxygen gets in, it breaks apart some of the alcohols and the fats and things, and it gives you those esters, and it creates these wonderful, wonderful tropical fruit flavors. So 1/3 of the whiskey is going to stay in those refill casks for the full maturation. The other 2/3, about 10 years ago, were revatted from the refill casks into Oloroso sherry butts. So 2/3 of the whiskey here has been finished for 10 years in Oloroso sherry casks, and 1/3 has been fully matured in the refill casks. And it is just a celebration of all those incredible tropical fruit flavors that Old Tomatin's known for, but with a layer of darker, kind of sherried influence in there.
Okay. So as I said to you before, I'm going to write this on here because that's basically where I'm at now. I genuinely, I've been sitting on this sample for about a week now, and I haven't. I did a cheeky little nose then when you were talking, but this is the first time I've genuinely tried this. So yeah, no pressure for me, but yeah. Obviously, like you said, that smells incredible. I'm just going to try it. Oh, this is what gets me, is that, like, genuinely, if I had, what did I say this was, 1,200 quid? Yeah. If I had 1,200 quid, this would be like, I would not have a problem with spending money on that at all, because that is incredible. But yeah, unfortunately, definitely beyond me. But my God, you can really tell. Like, I know what I was saying earlier about no age statements being good quality now and whatnot, but you cannot beat decades in cask. Yeah. You can't replicate that. You can't mess around with it. I mean, I've got this on over my shoulder here. I talk about it a couple of times. This one here. There you go. That's aged 9 days in a special reactor in Copenhagen, and they're doing things where they're trying to replicate, like what you said there about the chemical interactions, which they do a reasonable job of doing that, but you cannot replicate 3.5 decades in a cask.
No, but I think that's the point, is if you had put this into a virgin oak cask for 3.5 decades, it would be undrinkable, you know. So it's that it's different. And I think that's the whole point when I go back to age, is you can have really well-crafted, well-matured young whiskies, like Legacy, for example, but you can also have excellent things that are just the result of time. This was made at a time when Tomatin was the biggest distillery in the world, and everything we were producing was designed to go towards blends. It was not produced with the same level of care and focus towards it being a single malt that we produce today. But despite that, it survived all those years. You know, 99% of its sister casks have been blended at some point. This is a survivor. And it is just because of that time in a relatively tired cask. So, and I think that's, you know, you quite often, like with your reactor there, you'll go to a lot of other countries and they'll say, you know, because of the temperature here, the maturation is 3 times as fast as it is in Scotland. And that's true for that additive part of the maturation, from that, like the flavors of the wood coming into the whiskey. But that more kind of interactive style of maturation, it just cannot be rushed. Over in France, the guys in Cognac call it rancio, and it's a word that sums it up really well. It's kind of got that, it smells like walking into a dunnage warehouse. It smells like the passage of time, which is a hard thing to kind of summarize, but that's what this is. It's a liquid time capsule. What I love about a whiskey like this is, you know, we've tried the 12-year-old, great whiskey. We've tried the 36-year-old, great whiskey. Looking at both of those things and going, they're the same but different. You know, they're both whiskey, both made at the same place, by the same families. You know, we've got this generations of the same family living and working on site with the same ingredients, and they're totally different whiskies, but they're both really enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things I go on about a lot that people forget about, and obviously time's changing a bit now, but like, for instance, the first iPhone came out in like 2006. You know, so we're talking, what, I'm in bad maths now. What's that? 17 years ago? Yeah. So I mean, that's like what used to be a pretty typical age statement. So, and some of the stuff that was made like this, I mean, this is the funny thing about a 30 plus year old whiskey, is that I don't know about you, I think you're roughly about the same age as me, 30 something, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you think to yourself, 30 years ago, that was the 70s, right? But it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was late 80s and beyond, you know, like, well, was it 1990 now? 1993 was 30 years ago. My God. But yeah, so this was made, or distilled rather, just a couple of years after I was born.
Yeah.
Which is incredible. And they had nothing back then. I mean, internet existed, but computers weren't around.
I think that's another thing to just nod at, nudge, wink, wink. Some of it was made then.
Okay,
We've got to remember the 1980s was an incredibly bleak period for the industry. And although by 1980, I guess 1986, 1987, by the time this was made, we were back up and running, we'd been in liquidation for a couple of years. So we do, with the 36-year-old, there has to be a little bit of overaging in there. And like you say, that is reflected in the price, but it's also reflected in the sheer quality of the whiskey. So that's a great thing to bear in mind. But you're right, you know, you have that. I remember doing a tasting, and this is the beautiful thing about whiskey. We had a single cask, and I think it was let's say a 1988, and it had the date of distillation on it. And I was just saying, you know, where were you when this was being made? And I was saying, you know, I wasn't born yet, and there was another guy who was going through military training and stuff like that, and there was this mother and daughter in the room, and the mother was quite timid, but she put her hand up. I was like, yes, where were you? And she was like, I was in labor giving birth to this one. And it just happened that we'd found a whiskey distilled on the same date that girl was born. And you think, God, what the world has changed in that time. And as this has been sitting in warehouse 6, all of the whiskey from the 36-year-old is matured in warehouse 6. as it's been sitting in that giant time capsules of a building, the distillery has boomed, it's closed, it's revitalized, everything's changed around it. This has just been ticking over, waiting for Graham Unson to come along with a bung flogger and go, this one's ready.
Yeah, and that's the beautiful thing about it, and it's a shame that we're in a sort of era where getting access to that is getting harder and harder. Because I know you hear stories from people who were whiskey fans in the early 90s and late 80s that had access to 30-year-old single malts for a few raspberries or something.
Yeah.
And it's a shame, and it's getting even more expensive now. Even when I started whiskey 6, 7, 8 years ago on YouTube, I remember thinking to myself, some of the old boys going, I used to be able to get this. And I'm thinking, I'll never be like that. 7 years later, I'm exactly like that because I used to be able to get great quality 20-year-olds for less than 50 quid. And now I got no chance.
Yeah, I'll never forget being at a Yamazaki tasting. Really early on for me, 2012, 2013 anyway. And it was Tatsuya Maganawa, who now has the Highlander in Craigellachie, hosting the tasting. And I remember the 18-year-old, I think it being £55 or £60, and thinking, God, that's an awful lot of money for a Japanese whiskey. And now look at Yamazaki 18-year-old and like, God, what an idiot, And I think, again, the same thing's happening now. You're looking at the prices of whiskey increasing. You're going, God, that's an awful lot of money for a whiskey. Think about what we'll be like in 10 years' time. Just going, God, what an idiot I was. That's a great value. So snap it up.
Yeah. I mean, exactly what you're saying there about Japanese whiskey. I used to see the same two bottles, or it was at the Hakushu Distillers Reserve and the Yamazaki Distillers Reserve on the shelf in Sainsbury's for 45 quid.
Yeah.
And going, I'll get that when they put that on deal.
Yeah.
And then, now, I mean, if anyone found out those two bottles were on a shelf at Sainsbury's, there would be a crew of these people watching today rushing down to that shop to get it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just like Andrew Butler saying in there, unfortunately, when it was cheap, I had very little disposable income. Preach.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that's a pretty fair assessment for me as well. Back then I was looking at that thinking, God, I'm still on a student loan here, and so times have changed. But yeah, you do kind of wonder, what are those whiskies of tomorrow? You go back and think of what Black Bowmore was when it first came out and what it's become. Is what's sitting there now that could do stuff like that. But ultimately, they were really good whiskies. I think that's the key. Is they were really good whiskies at that same period of time where, as you said, there was some things that weren't really good whiskey out there. Whereas now, like I say, there's never been a better time to be a whiskey drinker.
Yeah, 100%. And Tomatin's not going anywhere. I mean, what did you tell me before this started about how many casks you've got?
Yeah, we've got it's about 70,000 casks of Tomatin. And the cool thing is, we've got warehousing capacity on site for all of them. So every drop of whiskey that you pick up from us, whether it's 36-year-old, 50-year-old, 5-year-old, it's been fully matured on site under our eyes. We've got our head offices there. So when I go to work, I go to the distillery. That's a really cool thing. So that kind of connection between the people who live on site in 30 cottages owned by the distillery, the fact that the whiskey stays there, the people, the place, the whiskey, that connection is pretty tight at Tomatin in a way you don't often see.
Yeah, and if I ever get up that far, you'll definitely be on my hit list for sure. And it will have to happen. It'll have to happen one day. I can't continue this gig. I remember saying that 7 years ago. I must get up there. Had the excuse of COVID.
Blame COVID.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, blame
it's
COVID.
A lot to answer for.
And when we were just coming out of COVID, I had a daughter as well. So she's now 3. So eventually she'll get big enough that I can leave them for a weekend and whatever. But yeah, it's, what it's like. You've got a small family yourself, haven't you? So it's it's tough. It's tough. One day.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was just saying there. We were down in the Lake District last week. I've got a 4-year-old and a 6-month-old, and unfortunately, a trip to the Lakes Distillery was not on the cards. But the arcade every night was fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly that. Family holidays, beach. That's what I do at the moment. Beach, UK beaches, nonetheless.
Yeah.
And just let them dig,
Yeah.
knack yourself out. Yeah,
Go back to a simpler time when digging is the most fun you can have.
yeah, 100%. Well, as always with these things, I've run over ever so slightly on the hour that I said, but it's been an absolute pleasure. I have a wee bit left in my glass that I'm going to enjoy for the rest of my evening probably, and I've actually kept some back as well. So what I might do, actually, I've decided. I'm going to say it on my Discord. I'm going to do a little wee giveaway to anyone who wants to enter that on the Discord, and UK based, and I'm going to send someone the rest of this.
Amazing.
On my Discord channel.
Someone's in for a big treat then.
Yeah, because I'm all about sharing the wealth for stuff like this. So I wish I could share it all with everybody, but yeah. It's been an absolutely incredible chat. Thank you very much for coming on and giving up your Monday evening.
No problem. No problem. I would probably not be drinking a whiskey this good if I wasn't on here. So
good excuse.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the excuse. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been brilliant. And as always, I'm now going to be bringing Tomatin. I keep saying Tomatin. It's Tomatin.
Yeah. As long as you're enjoying it, you can say it however you want.
Same you like, yeah. But I really must bring more of it to the channel and get more of it. I'm guilty of just covering new stuff all the time. These new distilleries, all new distilleries. But yeah. Don't overlook the old boys.
That's it. Sure. We've been around for a while for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. If you stay online for a quick second, and I'll say goodbye to everybody else. But thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you on more videos in the future and more live streams. Cheers.
Cheers.